Welcome everyone. Today we learn how to apply HTTP interceptors in Angular. So go to VS Code and create a new Angular application, open a new terminal and type ngn using the Angular CLI. Define the application name. I will inline styles, skip test and select the defaults for simplicity. After running the command, open the containing folder. An Angular interceptor is a middleware that can perform different tasks such as authentication, login, and caching. Let's create an authentication interceptor to append an access token for every HTTP request in our system. So open the Explorer and go to the Add folder. We'll add a new file called interceptors.TypeScript file. We'll define the interceptors as functions. So create a new function called authInterceptor. We'll define two parameters. The first one is the HTTP request, and the second parameter represents the next step for the interceptor chain. So add this parameter, and we'll return an observable of type HTTP event, which includes the HTTP response. To append the access token for every HTTP request, we'll add a new authorization header in the request. So to modify the HTTP request or HTTP response, we need to clone the object because they are immutable. So we'll create a new constant called request and we'll clone the request. And from this operator, we'll specify which parameters to modify. So we'll access the headers. We'll use the headers from the initial request, but we'll append a new header called authentication and we'll pass an access token. Finally, we'll return the next function with the new request. So we'll add a new auth service to get an access token, and we'll also learn how to inject a dependency in an interceptor. So create a new constant called token, and we'll use the inject API to inject the dependency called auth service, and we'll create a method called getToken. So open a terminal and we'll navigate to the add folder. We'll create a new service called auth, add the reference to this class, and we'll define a new method called getToken. So for this demo, we'll use DummyJSON, which provides a fake auth endpoint to get the user details. And for that, we need to pass the access token. So initially, we'll execute this HTTP request in a console window to get an access token based on the username and password provided in this request. So open a new console window, paste this request. Let's execute it. As you will see, we have an object with the access token. Let's copy the content of the access token and we'll just return in this function this value. Go back, let's save it. To configure the interceptor, we'll go to the app config file, and in the provided section we'll provide the HTTP client and we'll call the with interceptors function. To configure the interceptors from this HTTP client, this represents an array because we can add multiple interceptors. So let's initially add the auth interceptor. Let's save it. Now go to the main TypeScript file and we'll inject the HTTP client to perform an HTTP request and get the user details from DummyJSON. So create a new variable called HTTP. Let's use the inject API. We'll inject the HTTP client. So we'll create a new user observable to perform the HTTP request. So we'll call HTTP and this will be a get operation. We need the URL. So go back to DummyJSON, close the console window, scroll down, and to get the user details, we need to perform an HTTP request using this endpoint URL, and we need to pass the access token. So copy the URL and we'll subscribe to this observable. So in the import section, we'll use the async pipe. I will also use the JSON pipe to transform the user object into JSON format. So open the main HTML file, remove the sample code, we'll define the observable, We'll apply the async pipe to describe the observable, and finally the JSON pipe. Let's save it. Now in a terminal, we'll type ngs to save the application, open the Angular application, the browser, and you will see we have a null value because it's unauthorized. Go back to the interceptors, and we're appending the wrong name from the header. In this case is authorization instead of authentication. Let's save it. And as you will see, we have the user details by passing the authorization header. If you open the network tab, you will see that we have the response from DummyJSON, and you will see in the request headers that we're passing the access token. If by accident we send the wrong token, we have a null user, and you will see we have in the console window an internal server error from DummyJSON and HTTP error response. So go back and fix the token, and we have the successful response. We can also add multiple interceptors and chain them. Angular applies the interceptors in the order they are provided in the add configuration file. So let's create a second interceptor to log the response. So let's copy the first function and rename this as login interceptor. Instead of modifying the HTTP request, we'll use some RxJS operators to log the response. So we'll return the next function based on the initial request, and we'll use the pipe function to apply some RxJS operators. So we'll use the tab operator to log the response. So we'll check if the event type is HTTP event type that response. We'll log multiple parameters from the HTTP response. The first one will be the URL from the event.url. Then we'll show the status code. And finally, we'll show the response, so called event.body. So finally, we'll add error handling in interceptors. So for handling errors in HTTP interceptors, we'll use the catch error operator. So add this operator, we'll get the error, and we'll log the error with a message HTTP error and pass the error, and we'll return an observable error. So for that, we'll use another RxJS operator called throw error, and we'll just pass the error. So in this login interceptor, we log the URL, status code, and the response from the HTTP response, and we're handling errors with the catch error operator. Let's save it and go to the config file. We'll change this interceptor in the HTTP client configuration. Let's save it. Go back to the Angular application. As you will see, we're applying the login interceptor. We have the URL, the status code, and the response from DummyJSON. Go back and send a wrong token. Let's save it. And now we're successfully handling errors with the catch error function. We have the internal server error from DummyJSON, and from the interceptor you will see the HTTP error message with the object which represents the error, and we're sending an observable error which is an HTTP error response with all the details. So in this demo we'll learn how to apply HTTP interceptors in Angular.